What if the worst thing that ever happened to you became the very thing that saved your life? In the harsh wilderness of Montana, where men ruled with iron fists and women were treated as property, one young woman's story would shatter every expectation. She was handed over like cattle, meant to be broken and forgotten. Instead, she would become a legend that people still whisper about today. This is not just a story of survival, it's a testament to the unbreakable human spirit that refuses to bow, even when the whole world conspires against you. The wagon wheels creaked against the frozen ground as they rolled through the gates of the Double R Ranch. Sarah McKenna pressed her face against the small window, watching the endless stretch of snow-covered land that would now be her prison. Her breath fogged the glass as she tried to steady her racing heart. Just 3 days ago, she had been living a simple life in the mining town of Silver Creek, working at the general store and caring for her ailing father. Now, everything had changed in the cruelest way possible. Her father's gambling debts had finally caught up with them. When he couldn't pay what he owed to the loan sharks, they had come calling with a solution that made Sarah's blood run cold. Instead of money, they would take her. She would be given to Jake Morrison, the notorious rancher who owned thousands of acres and had a reputation for being as hard as the mountains that surrounded his land. The men had laughed as they explained the arrangement, calling it a fair trade and making jokes about how Morrison needed someone to warm his bed during the cold Montana winters. Sarah's father had been too sick and broken to fight for her. The consumption had taken most of his strength, and the shame of his gambling addiction had taken the rest. He could barely look at her as the men dragged her away, tears streaming down his weathered face. She wanted to hate him, but all she felt was a deep sadness for the man who had once been her hero. The ranch house came into view as the wagon climbed a small hill. It was bigger than Sarah had expected, a 2-story log structure with smoke rising from multiple chimneys. Outbuildings dotted the landscape around it, and she could see cattle scattered across the distant fields despite the winter cold. This was clearly the home of a successful man, which somehow made her situation feel even more hopeless. "Well, there she is," called out Pete, the man driving the wagon. He was one of the loan sharks who had taken her from town, a thin man with greasy hair and a constant smirk. "Your new home, darling. Hope you're ready to earn your keep." Sarah said nothing. She had learned during the 3-day journey that silence was her best defense. These men fed on fear and desperation, and she was determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing either in her. Instead, she sat straight and kept her chin up, even though her heart was pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it. The front door of the ranch house opened before the wagon had fully stopped. A tall figure emerged, and Sarah got her first look at Jake Morrison. He was not what she had expected. The story she had heard painted him as a monster, a man who ruled his land with cruelty and had driven away 3 wives already. But the man standing on the porch looked more tired than terrifying. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that suggested he spent more time working than grooming. His clothes were practical rather than fancy, and his boots were worn from years of hard use. What surprised Sarah most were his eyes. Even from a distance, she could see they were a deep blue, and they held an expression she hadn't expected. Instead of the cold calculation she was prepared for, she saw something that looked almost like reluctance. "Morrison," Pete called out as he climbed down from the wagon. "Got your delivery right here, just like we agreed." Jake Morrison walked slowly down the steps, his gaze moving from Pete to the wagon where Sarah sat. When their eyes met, she felt a strange jolt of electricity. She had expected to see cruelty or lust, but, instead, his expression was unreadable. He stopped a few feet from the wagon and crossed his arms. "This wasn't my idea," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Pete laughed and slapped his knee. "Course it was. You're the one who suggested alternative payment when her daddy couldn't come up with the cash. Don't go getting cold feet now." Sarah watched Jake's jaw tighten. "I said he could work off the debt. I never said anything about bringing me a woman." "Well, she can work too," Pete said with a leer. "All kinds of work a pretty thing like her can do for a lonely rancher." The color drained from Sarah's face, but she forced herself to remain steady. She would not show weakness, no matter what happened next. Jake's hands clenched into fists at his sides. That's not what I meant, and you know it. Look, Morrison, Pete's voice turns serious. The arrangement is made. McKenna owes us $1,500, plus interest. That's more money than he'll see in 5 lifetimes, and we both know it. The girl is payment in full. You can do whatever you want with her after we're gone. Sarah finally found her voice. I can speak for myself. Both men turned to look at her with surprise. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help, her legs shaky after the long ride but her determination strong. She was small compared to these men, barely reaching Jake's shoulder, but she stood as tall as she could. My name is Sarah McKenna, she said, looking directly at Jake. I didn't choose to be here, but I'm not going to cower either. If you think you own me because of my father's debts, you're wrong. I'll work to pay what's owed, but I won't be anyone's property. Pete burst out laughing. Well, would you listen to that? Got yourself a feisty one, Morrison. She'll be fun to break in. Jake's face darkened. Watch your mouth. The warning in his voice was unmistakable, and Pete's laughter died away. Sarah looked between the two men, trying to understand the dynamic she had stumbled into. There was clearly more history here than she knew about. Look, Jake said, running a hand through his hair. This whole situation is wrong. The girl shouldn't have to pay for her father's mistakes. But she is paying, Pete said firmly. That's how this works. McKenna signed the papers. She belongs to you now, legal and proper. You can keep her or sell her or do whatever you please, but she's your responsibility either way. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face at the casual way Pete talked about selling her, but she refused to show her fear. Instead, she focused on Jake's reaction. His face had gone pale, and she could see the muscles in his jaw working as he gritted his teeth. I don't want a woman who doesn't want to be here, Jake said finally. Then, convince her she wants to be here, Pete replied with a shrug. That's your problem now. Our business is done. He climbed back onto the wagon and signaled to his partner, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. Sarah's few belongings were tossed down onto the ground, and then, the wagon was rolling away, leaving her alone with Jake Morrison. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the wagon disappear down the road. The wind picked up, cutting through Sarah's thin coat and making her shiver. She wrapped her arms around herself and tried to think about what to do next. You must be cold, Jake said finally. His voice was gentler than she expected. I'm fine, she lied, though her teeth were starting to chatter. Jake looked at her for a moment, then bent down to pick up her belongings. Come inside. We need to talk. Sarah hesitated. Once she went into that house, there would be no going back. But the alternative was standing in the cold Montana wind until she froze to death, and that didn't seem like much of a choice. I meant what I said, she told him as they walked toward the house. I won't be anyone's property. Jake stopped walking and turned to face her. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and worry. He was older than she had first thought, probably in his 30s, and there was a weariness about him that went deeper than physical exhaustion. And I meant what I said too, he replied. I don't want a woman who doesn't want to be here. Then, why didn't you send me back? Jake was quiet for a moment, looking out over his land. Because there's nowhere for you to go back to. Your father is dying, and those men would just sell you to someone else. At least here, you'll be safe. The word safe hung in the air between them. Sarah wanted to believe him, but she had learned the hard way that men's promises were often worth nothing. Still, there was something in his voice that made her want to trust him, even against her better judgment. What do you expect from me? She asked. Jake picked up her bags again and started walking toward the house. I expect you to help me figure out how we're both going to survive this situation we've been forced into. The inside of the ranch house was warm and surprisingly comfortable. A fire crackled in a large stone fireplace, and the furniture looked handmade but well-crafted. Sarah had expected something crude and masculine, but the house felt more like a home than a bachelor's den. There were even curtains on the windows and books on the shelves. "Coffee?" Jake asked, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She was still trying to process everything that had happened and figure out what kind of man Jake Morrison really was. He seemed different from what she had expected, but she knew she couldn't let her guard down. Jake busied himself making coffee, moving around the kitchen with practiced ease. Sarah watched him, noting the way he handled the simple tasks with care and efficiency. His movements were those of a man who was used to taking care of himself. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, needing to break the silence. "Bought the place 12 years ago," Jake replied, not looking up from his work. "Built most of it with my own hands. It's beautiful." He glanced at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected a compliment. "Thank you." The coffee was strong and hot, warming Sarah from the inside. She cupped the mug in her hands and let the heat seep into her fingers. For the first time in days, she felt almost human again. "I should explain about those men," Jake said, settling into a chair across from her. "Pete and his partner work for Marcus Brennan. He runs most of the gambling and loan business in the territory. When people can't pay what they owe, he finds creative ways to collect. Like trading me for my father's debt. That wasn't supposed to happen. When your father came to me last month, he was desperate. He said Brennan's men were threatening to kill him if he didn't pay up. I told him he could work here to earn the money, but I guess that wasn't fast enough for Brennan." Sarah felt a spark of anger. "So you knew about my father's debt?" "I knew he owed money. I didn't know they would use you to pay it. But you could have refused to take me." Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. "Yes, I could have. But then, they would have taken you to someone else, someone who might not treat you as well. And how do I know you'll treat me well?" The question hung between them. Jake looked up and met her eyes directly. "I guess you don't. You'll have to decide that for yourself." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception or cruelty. What she saw instead was a tired man who seemed as trapped by the situation as she was. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we figure out how to make this work. I need help running this place, and you need somewhere safe to stay. Maybe we can help each other." "You're talking about a business arrangement." "I'm talking about survival." Sarah set down her coffee cup and looked around the room again. The house was comfortable, and Jake seemed decent enough, but she was still essentially a prisoner. She had no money, no way to leave, and nowhere to go even if she could. "What kind of help do you need?" she asked finally. Jake seemed to relax slightly at her practical question. "Cooking, cleaning, bookkeeping. I've been managing alone, but it would be easier with help. In return, you'd have a roof over your head and food to eat." "And that's all?" The question was loaded with meaning, and they both knew it. Jake's face grew serious. "That's all," he said firmly. "You'd have your own room, and your privacy would be respected. I'm not looking for a wife or a companion. I just need help, and you need a place to stay." Sarah wanted to believe him, but she had to be sure. "What about the legal papers Pete mentioned? Do you really own me now?" Jake's face darkened. "Those papers are garbage. No one owns another person, no matter what some corrupt judge might write down. You're free to leave anytime you want. But I have nowhere to go." "Then, stay. But stay because you choose to, not because you think you have to." The offer was better than Sarah had dared to hope for. A safe place to live, honest work to do, and respect for her independence. It seemed too good to be true, but Jake's eyes held no deception that she could see. "I'll need time to think about it," she said. "Take all the time you need. In the meantime, you can stay in the guest room upstairs. There's a lock on the door if it makes you feel safer." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. After 3 days of fear and uncertainty, his kindness was almost overwhelming. She blinked hard and nodded. Thank you. Jake showed her to a small but comfortable room on the second floor. There was a bed with clean sheets, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the ranch. True to his word, there was a solid lock on the door. "Dinner is usually around 6, he said from the doorway. "You're welcome to join me, or I can bring something up if you prefer." "I'll come down," Sarah said. She was exhausted, but she wasn't ready to hide away just yet. Jake nodded and started to leave, then turned back. "Sarah? For what it's worth, I'm sorry about how you ended up here. You deserve better than this." After he left, Sarah sat on the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. A week ago, her biggest worry had been whether her father would be well enough to eat dinner. Now she was living with a stranger, bound by her father's debts, and completely dependent on the kindness of a man she barely knew. But Jake Morrison wasn't what she had expected. He seemed honorable, and he had shown her more respect in one afternoon than most men showed women in a lifetime. Maybe, just maybe, she could make a life here. Not the life she had planned, but a life nonetheless. As the sun began to set over the Montana mountains, Sarah unpacked her few belongings and prepared to face whatever came next. She had survived the worst day of her life, and she was still standing. That had to count for something. Outside her window, she could see Jake working in the barn, his movements efficient and purposeful. He was a mystery to her, this quiet rancher who had been forced to take her in. But mysteries could be solved, and Sarah had always been good at solving puzzles. She would stay, at least for now. She would work hard and prove her worth, and she would find out what kind of man Jake Morrison really was. And if he turned out to be different from what he seemed, well, she would deal with that when the time came. For the first time in days, Sarah allowed herself to feel a small spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get her through the night. And tomorrow, she would start building whatever came next. Sarah woke to the sound of roosters crowing and sunlight streaming through her window. For a moment, she forgot where she was and expected to see her father's small cabin around her. Then, reality crashed back, and she remembered everything that had happened. She was at Jake Morrison's ranch, bound by her father's gambling debts to a man she barely knew. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted up from downstairs, making her stomach rumble. She hadn't eaten much during the journey to the ranch, and the little bit of dinner she had managed the night before wasn't enough to sustain her. She dressed quickly in one of her two good dresses and made her way downstairs. Jake was standing at the stove, flipping bacon in a large cast iron pan. He looked up when she entered the kitchen, and she was struck again by how different he seemed from the monster she had imagined. His hair was still messy from sleep, and there was something almost boyish about the way he smiled at her. "Morning," he said. "Hope you're hungry. I made too much, as usual." "I can cook," Sarah offered, feeling awkward about being served. "I'm sure you can, but today you're my guest. Tomorrow we can figure out a routine if you decide to stay." The word "if" hung in the air between them. Sarah appreciated that he wasn't assuming her decision, but it also reminded her how precarious her situation was. She sat at the small wooden table and accepted the plate of eggs and bacon he offered her. "Did you sleep well?" Jake asked, settling across from her with his own breakfast. "Better than I expected," Sarah admitted. The bed had been comfortable, and, despite everything, exhaustion had eventually won out over anxiety. "Good. I know this is all strange for you." They ate in companionable silence for a while. Sarah found herself stealing glances at Jake, trying to figure him out. He ate with good manners but without pretension, and she noticed his hands were scarred and calloused from years of hard work. These weren't the hands of a man who sat around giving orders. He worked alongside his men, which spoke well of his character. "Tell me about the ranch," Sarah said, hoping conversation would ease the awkwardness she felt. Jake's face lit up slightly. "Started with just 100 acres and a dozen cattle. Now we've got nearly 2,000 acres and close to 500 head of cattle. Got 8 men working for me full-time, more during branding season. That's quite an accomplishment. It's been a lot of work. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it." There was a weariness in his voice that made Sarah look at him more closely. Why wouldn't it be worth it? Jake was quiet for a moment, pushing eggs around on his plate. Gets lonely, I guess. A man can work himself to death building something, but if there's no one to share it with, what's the point? Sarah felt a pang of sympathy for him. What happened to your wives? I heard there were 3. Jake's face darkened, and Sarah immediately regretted asking. I'm sorry. That was too personal. No, it's all right. You'll hear the stories anyway, might as well hear the truth. Jake set down his fork and looked out the window. First wife was Emily. Married her when I was 22 and stupid. She was from back east, thought ranch life would be romantic. When she realized it meant hard work and isolation, she left. Took half of everything I'd built with her. Sarah could hear the old hurt in his voice. Second was Catherine. Local girl, seemed to understand what she was getting into. But she wanted children, and... He trailed off, his jaw tightening. You don't want children? Sarah asked gently. I wanted them. Just couldn't give them to her. After 3 years of trying and losing, she decided she'd rather be alone than with me. The pain in his voice made Sarah's heart ache. And the third? Jake let out a bitter laugh. Margaret. She married me for the ranch, pure and simple. Thought she could outlast me and inherit everything. When she realized I wasn't going to conveniently die, she tried to poison me. Sarah gasped. That's terrible. Had her arrested, but her family had connections. She got off with a warning and a one-way ticket back to her family in California. That was 5 years ago. I'm sorry, Sarah said softly. That must have been horrible. Jake looked at her with surprise. Most people around here think I'm cursed. 3 failed marriages don't exactly make a man look like good husband material. Most people around here don't know what really happened. And you believe me? Sarah studied his face carefully. I think you're too honest to lie about something like that. Besides, if you were really a monster, you wouldn't have told me those stories. You would have let me believe whatever I wanted. Something shifted in Jake's expression. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked truly relaxed. Thank you, he said quietly. After breakfast, Jake offered to show Sarah around the ranch. She accepted, partly because she was curious and partly because she needed to understand her new environment if she was going to survive here. The double R was impressive by any standard. The main house sat on a small rise overlooking the rest of the operation. Below them were the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived, a large barn for the horses, cattle pens, and various outbuildings for equipment and supplies. Everything looked well maintained and organized. How many people live here? Sarah asked as they walked toward the barn. Besides me, there's Cookie who does the cooking for the men, and 8 ranch hands. They're good men, mostly. I don't tolerate troublemakers. As if summoned by their conversation, a group of men emerged from the bunkhouse. Sarah instinctively moved closer to Jake, and she felt him tense beside her. Morning, boss, called out a tall man with graying hair. Heard you got yourself some company. Morning, Tom. This is Miss McKenna. She'll be staying at the house for a while. Sarah noticed that Jake didn't elaborate on their arrangement, and she was grateful for his discretion. The men looked at her with obvious curiosity, but she was relieved not to see the leering expression she had feared. Ma'am, Tom said, touching his hat. The other men followed suit, and Sarah began to relax slightly. Pleasure to meet you all, she said. Tom's my foreman, Jake explained. Been with me almost from the beginning. Somebody's got to keep this stubborn fool from working himself to death, Tom said with obvious affection. Sarah could see the easy camaraderie between the two men and found herself feeling envious. She had never had friendships like that, built on years of shared work and mutual respect. They continued their tour, with Jake explaining the various aspects of ranch operation. Sarah was impressed by his knowledge and attention to detail. Every decision seemed carefully considered, from the placement of the water troughs to the rotation of the cattle between pastures. "You really built all this yourself?" she asked as they stood on a hill overlooking the main pasture. "With help. Tom and a few of the other men have been with me for years. But, yes, every fence post, every building, every decision about where to expand or what cattle to buy. It's been my life for 12 years. Sarah could hear the pride in his voice, and she understood why. Building something like this from nothing took incredible dedication and skill. "What would you do if you had to start over?" she asked. Jake looked at her with surprise. "Why would I have to start over?" "I don't know. I was just wondering what you'd do if you lost it all." Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering her question. "I guess I'd start over. Find some land, get a few cattle, and build again. Can't imagine doing anything else. Even after everything you've been through? The failed marriages, the loneliness, all the hard work? Especially because of all that. This ranch is who I am, Sarah. Without it, I'm just another drifter with no purpose." Sarah understood that feeling better than she cared to admit. She had lost her purpose when her father's gambling destroyed their life. Now she was adrift, trying to figure out who she was supposed to be. They walked back toward the house in comfortable silence. Sarah found herself studying Jake from the corner of her eye. He moved with the confident stride of a man who knew exactly where he belonged. She envied him that certainty. "What did you do before you came here?" Jake asked, as if reading her thoughts. "Helped my father with his claims, worked at the general store, took care of our house." "Nothing very exciting. Did you enjoy it?" Sarah thought about that. "I enjoyed taking care of people. My father, the customers at the store, neighbors who needed help. I guess I liked being useful." "You can be useful here, if you want to be." The offer was simple, but Sarah heard the deeper meaning. He was giving her a chance to belong somewhere again, to have a purpose. It was more than she had dared to hope for. "What exactly would you want me to do?" she asked. "Whatever you're good at. The house needs a woman's touch, the books could use organizing, and Cookie's getting too old to handle all the cooking by himself. There's plenty of work if you want it. And, in return? Room, board, and a fair wage. This isn't charity, Sarah. I need help, and you need work. It's a business arrangement, nothing more." Sarah appreciated his directness, but she also heard what he wasn't saying. He was offering her independence and dignity, two things that had been stripped away from her. "I'll need to see my father," she said, "before I make any decisions." Jake nodded. "Tom can drive you to town tomorrow if you want." "Thank you." That afternoon, Sarah helped Jake with the bookkeeping. She discovered that her time working at the general store had given her skills that were valuable on a ranch. She could read and write well, was good with numbers, and understood the basics of running a business. "You're better at this than I am," Jake admitted as she organized a stack of receipts he had been ignoring for months. "I like putting things in order," Sarah said. "It makes me feel like I have some control over chaos." Jake looked at her thoughtfully. "Is that what your life feels like right now? Chaos?" Sarah paused in her work. "Wouldn't yours feel chaotic if you'd been ripped away from everything you knew and given to a stranger?" "I guess it would." "I'm sorry about that, Sarah. I wish things could have been different." "So do I. But wishing doesn't change anything." "No, it doesn't. But we can still make the best of the situation we're in." That evening, Jake taught Sarah how to play chess. She had never learned, having grown up in a world where such games were considered frivolous, but she found she had a talent for strategy. "You're thinking too much," Jake said as she studied the board. "How can someone think too much? Chess is about instinct as much as planning. You have to trust your gut sometimes." Sarah moved her piece and was surprised when Jake's face showed genuine concern. "That was a good move," he admitted. "You sound worried." "I am. I have a feeling you're going to be beating me at this game very soon." Sarah laughed, and the sound surprised both of them. It was the first time she had truly laughed since her father's illness began. "I'm sorry," she said, suddenly self-conscious. "Don't apologize for laughing. This house hasn't had enough laughter in it." As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself relaxing more than she had since arriving at the ranch. Jake was easy to talk to, and their conversation ranged from books to music to their dreams for the future. She discovered that he was well-read and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that made her smile. "What's your favorite book?" Jake asked as they finished their game. "Pride and Prejudice," Sarah admitted. "I know it's silly, but I love the idea that two people can completely misunderstand each other and still find their way to happiness." "That's not silly at all. I think most relationships start with misunderstandings. What about you? What's your favorite book?" "The Count of Monte Cristo. I like stories about justice and second chances." Sarah thought about that as she helped Jake clean up the chess pieces. Everyone deserved a second chance, herself included. Maybe this strange arrangement could be hers. "Jake," she said as they prepared to go upstairs. "Yes? Thank you for being kind to me today. I know you didn't have to be." Jake paused at the bottom of the stairs. "Sarah, I want you to understand something. You being here isn't a burden or an obligation. If you decide to stay, it'll be because we choose to help each other. There's a difference. I'm starting to see that." "Good. And, Sarah? Tomorrow, when you see your father, remember that his mistakes don't define you. You get to choose who you want to be from now on." As Sarah lay in bed that night, she thought about Jake's words. For the first time since her world had fallen apart, she felt like she might have some control over her future. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was a life. And maybe that was enough to start with. She could hear Jake moving around downstairs, banking the fire and checking the doors before bed. There was something comforting about the domestic sounds, about knowing she wasn't alone in the house. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Tomorrow she would see her father and make her decision. But tonight, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she could belong. It wouldn't be easy, and there were still so many unknowns, but Jake Morrison had shown her kindness when he could have shown her cruelty. That had to count for something. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah's last thought was that sometimes the worst thing that happened to you could lead to something unexpectedly good. She wasn't ready to trust that completely yet, but she was beginning to believe it might be possible. Outside her window, the Montana wind whistled through the trees, but inside the house, all was warm and quiet. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah McKenna felt like she might have found a home. The ride to Silver Creek took 3 hours, and, with each mile that passed, Sarah felt her anxiety growing. She hadn't seen her father since the day she was taken, and she wasn't sure what she would find when she arrived. Tom drove the wagon with his usual steady competence, but he seemed to sense her mood and kept the conversation light. "Boss is a good man," he said as they neared the town. "Had some hard breaks, but he's fair and honest. Not many like him left." "You've been with him a long time," Sarah observed. 12 years. Came here right after my wife died, looking for work and a place to start over. Jake gave me both when nobody else would. Why wouldn't anyone else hire you?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "I had a drinking problem after Mary passed. Jake saw past that and gave me a chance to prove myself. Been sober ever since." Sarah looked at the older man with new respect. "That must have been difficult." "Some things are worth being difficult for. Working for Jake, building something meaningful, that gave me a reason to stay sober." As they entered Silver Creek, Sarah was struck by how small and shabby the town looked after just a few days at the ranch. The buildings were mostly unpainted wood, and mud from the recent thaw made the streets nearly impassable. She had never noticed how rundown everything was when she lived here. Her father's cabin sat at the edge of town, looking even smaller and more ramshackle than she remembered. Tom helped her down from the wagon and waited while she gathered her courage. I'll wait here, he said kindly. Take all the time you need. Sarah knocked on the door and waited. When there was no answer, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit her immediately, the sour odor of sickness and unwashed clothes. Her father was lying on his narrow bed, looking even thinner and more frail than when she had left. Papa, she said softly. William McKenna opened his eyes and focused on her with difficulty. When recognition dawned, his face crumpled with shame and relief. Sarah girl, he whispered. I thought I'd never see you again. Sarah pulled a chair next to his bed and took his thin hand in hers. His skin was hot with fever, and she could see that the consumption had progressed rapidly in just a few days. How are you feeling? She asked. Like a man who's dying, he said with brutal honesty. But better now that you're here. Are you all right? Did that rancher, did he hurt you? No, Papa. He's been kind to me. Better than I expected. William's eyes searched her face. You're not just saying that to make me feel better? I'm not. Jake Morrison is a good man. He's offered me work and a safe place to stay. Jake Morrison, William repeated. I met him once, you know. Came to town looking for workers. Seemed decent enough, but I never imagined. He trailed off, coughing violently. Sarah waited for the coughing fit to pass, then helped him sip some water from a glass by his bed. Papa, I need to know something. Did you really sign papers giving me to Morrison? William's face crumpled. I was desperate, Sarah. Brennan's men said they'd kill me if I didn't pay up, and I knew I never could. When they suggested alternative payment, I thought maybe if I signed something, it would buy me time to figure out another solution. But you signed them. I signed them because I was a coward and a fool. I told myself Morrison was a decent man and would treat you well, but the truth is I was just trying to save my own skin. Tears ran down his weathered cheeks. I'm so sorry, girl. I've ruined your life because I couldn't control my gambling. Sarah felt her anger dissolving as she looked at her broken father. He was dying, filled with regret, and punishing him further wouldn't change anything. You didn't ruin my life, Papa. You changed it, but that's not the same thing. What do you mean? Sarah told him about the ranch, about Jake's offer of work and independence, about the possibility of building a new life. As she spoke, she realized that she had already made her decision. You sound like you want to stay, William observed. I think I do. There's nothing for me here anymore, and Jake needs help. It's not the life I planned, but it might be a good one. William squeezed her hand weakly. Then, you have my blessing, for whatever that's worth. I just want you to be safe and happy. What about you? I can't just leave you here alone. You can and you will. I've got maybe a few weeks left, and I'd rather spend them knowing you're somewhere safe than worrying about how you'll survive after I'm gone. Sarah felt tears threatening and blinked them back. I don't want to leave you. And I don't want to be the reason you miss out on a chance at happiness. Go back to the ranch, Sarah. Make a life for yourself. That's all any parent really wants for their child. They talked for another hour, and Sarah was relieved to see some of her father's old spirit return as they discussed her future. He even managed to smile when she told him about beating Jake at chess. Always were too smart for your own good, he said fondly. When it was time to leave, Sarah kissed her father's forehead and promised to visit again soon. They both knew it was likely the last time they would see each other, but neither said it aloud. I love you, Papa, she said from the doorway. I love you too, girl. More than you'll ever know. The ride back to the ranch passed in contemplative silence. Tom seemed to understand that she needed time to process her emotions, and Sarah was grateful for his sensitivity. As the ranch buildings came into view, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected. She felt like she was coming home. The realization surprised her, but there was no denying the sense of belonging that washed over her as they rolled through the gates. Jake was waiting on the porch, and Sarah could see the concern in his eyes as Tom helped her down from the wagon. How is he? Jake asked simply. Dying, Sarah replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. But, I got to say goodbye. Jake nodded, understanding that there were some conversations that didn't need many words. I've made my decision, Sarah continued. If the offer still stands, I'd like to stay and work here. Something shifted in Jake's expression, and Sarah realized he had been more worried about her answer than he had let on. The offer stands, he said. We can work out the details over dinner. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table with papers spread between them. Jake had drawn up a formal agreement that outlined Sarah's duties and compensation. She was impressed by his thoroughness and fairness. $30 a month plus room and board, she read aloud. That's more than generous. It's fair pay for the work you'll be doing. I don't believe in taking advantage of people. Sarah thought about the arrangements some women in her situation might have been forced into and felt a wave of gratitude for Jake's integrity. What about the legal papers Papa signed? She asked. Jake pulled out a document and set it on the table. Sarah recognized her father's shaky signature at the bottom. What are you doing with that? She asked. Watch. Jake struck a match and held it to the corner of the paper. They both watched as the flames consumed the document that had bound her to him. You didn't have to do that, Sarah said, though she felt a tremendous sense of relief watching the papers burn. Yes, I did. I told you before, no one owns another person. This makes it official. But, what if someone questions my being here? Then, we'll show them our employment agreement. You're here because you choose to be, not because anyone forced you. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. In burning those papers, Jake had given her back her freedom. The fact that she was choosing to stay made all the difference in the world. Over the following weeks, Sarah settled into her new life with surprising ease. She took over most of the household management, organized Jake's chaotic office, and began helping Cookie with meals for the ranch hands. Her days were full and productive, and, for the first time in years, she felt truly useful. The ranch hands accepted her presence with good-natured respect. They appreciated having decent meals and a woman's touch around the place, and Sarah found herself enjoying their company. They treated her like a respected member of the team rather than an intruder, and she began to feel like she belonged. Her relationship with Jake evolved slowly from cautious cooperation to genuine friendship. They fell into comfortable routines, chess games in the evenings, shared meals, conversations about books and current events. Sarah discovered that Jake was intelligent and well-informed, with strong opinions about everything from politics to poetry. You're wasted out here, she told him one evening as they discussed a book they had both read. What do you mean? You could have been a teacher or a lawyer or a businessman in the city. Instead, you're stuck out here talking to cattle all day. Jake smiled. I'm not stuck anywhere. I chose this life because it suits me. Besides, who says intelligence is wasted just because it's not on display in some fancy office? I didn't mean to insult you. You didn't. But, I want you to understand something, Sarah. Success isn't just about how much education you have or how much money you make. Sometimes it's about building something worthwhile and living according to your own principles. Sarah thought about that as she watched him move his chess piece. Jake had built something remarkable here, not just the physical ranch but the relationships and respect that came with it. Maybe he was more successful than she had realized. 3 weeks after her arrival, word came that William McKenna had passed away in his sleep. Sarah had been expecting the news, but it still hit her harder than she had anticipated. Jake found her crying in the kitchen and held her while she grieved for the father who had loved her despite his failings. He was a good man who made bad choices, Jake said as she sobbed against his shoulder. I know. I just wish things could have been different. So did he. That's why he was willing to let you go. He wanted you to have the life he couldn't give you. The funeral was small, attended mostly by people who remembered William from his better days. Sarah was surprised by how many people spoke kindly of her father, sharing stories of his generosity and humor before the gambling consumed him. Jake stood beside her throughout the service, a steady presence that helped her get through the difficult day. When it was over, she realized that her old life was officially buried with her father. Whatever came next would be entirely her choice. "Are you all right?" Jake asked as they drove back to the ranch. "I think so." It's strange, feeling sad and relieved at the same time. "That's normal. You're mourning who he was and who he could have been, but you're also free from worrying about him." "Is that terrible of me?" "It's honest. And honesty is usually the healthiest approach to grief." Spring came early that year, and with it came a sense of renewal that Sarah hadn't expected. She threw herself into her work with increased enthusiasm, taking on more responsibilities and making improvements to the household systems that impressed everyone. "You've transformed this place," Tom told her one morning as she served breakfast to the ranch hands. "Feels more like a home now." Sarah felt a warm glow of pride at his words. She had always been good at taking care of people, and it felt wonderful to use those skills in service of something she cared about. Her relationship with Jake continued to deepen, though both of them were careful to maintain appropriate boundaries. Sarah was keenly aware that she was still vulnerable, dependent on his goodwill for her security, and she didn't want to complicate their arrangement with romantic feelings. But the feelings were there, whether she acknowledged them or not. She found herself watching Jake when he thought she wasn't looking, admiring the way he handled his men with firmness and fairness, the way he could gentle a skittish horse with patience and understanding. He was everything she had dreamed a man could be: strong but not cruel, confident but not arrogant, successful but not selfish. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jake surprised her with a question. "Do you ever think about getting married?" he asked. Sarah's heart skipped, but she kept her voice steady. "Sometimes." "Why?" "I've been thinking about it myself lately. This place feels more like a home with you here, and I realize I don't want to be alone anymore." "Jake," Sarah began, not sure what to say. "I'm not proposing," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'd be honored if you'd consider me." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "You don't have to marry me out of obligation or pity. That's not why I'd marry you. I'd marry you because you're the strongest, smartest, most capable woman I've ever known. Because you make me laugh and challenge me to think differently about things. Because I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore." Sarah looked at him through her tears. "You really mean that?" "I've never meant anything more in my life." "Then, yes," she said softly. "When I'm ready, I'll consider you. More than consider you." Jake reached over and took her hand. "We have all the time in the world, Sarah. No pressure, no expectations. Just two people who care about each other figuring out how to build a life together." As they sat holding hands and watching the stars come out over Montana, Sarah marveled at how much her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been given to Jake Morrison as a cruel joke, a punishment for her father's debts. Now she was choosing to stay with him, choosing to build something beautiful from the wreckage of her old life. It hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but Sarah had learned something important: sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can lead to the best thing in your life. You just have to be brave enough to see the possibilities and strong enough to seize them. The girl who had been handed over like property was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and had chosen her own destiny. And that, Sarah thought as she squeezed Jake's hand, was the best kind of ending she could have asked for. In the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, and Jake squeezed her hand back. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but tonight, Sarah McKenna was exactly where she belonged. Home.